When the DCU's first chapter titled Gods and Monsters was revealed all the way back in January of 2023, there were a few projects that I was immediately excited for without knowing anything about who would be writing, directing, or potentially starring in the project. Just the premise alone was enough to sell me on the idea, and outside of Superman, the project I was the most excited for was the Lanterns TV series, which was set to be a story about Jon Stewart and Hal Jordan, who discover a terrifying mystery on Earth which would tie into the larger story of the DCU, and the series would take inspiration from one of HBO's greatest series, that being True Detective, and for me, that was all I needed to know, and for the most part, it seemed like that's all the rest of the internet needed to know, as it was largely heralded as one of the most highly anticipated projects of the DCU's first chapter. But over the last few years, as we've gotten closer to the show's release and we've learned more about the direction of the overall project, it seems that anticipation and excitement has turned into worry and anger about the overall direction of the show, and instead of being one of the DCU's most highly anticipated projects, it's become one of the most controversial. However, for me personally, despite some maybe controversial decisions that we will talk about in this video, I still am immensely excited for this project, and my excitement has only continued to grow as we have learned more about who's going to be working behind the scenes, the potential story, and of course the actors that have been casted in these major roles. And today I want to talk about why I still believe there is special potential for this Lantern series, and why it's easily my most highly anticipated DCU project of 2026. But before we talk about all of the things that I think DC is doing right with this show and why I think there is so much potential, we do have to start with the controversial decision to cast a 60-year-old as Hal Jordan, which is what many fans are immensely upset about, and I'll be honest, I totally agree and understand. I do not think it's wise to take one of DC's most iconic characters and age them up to a point where you would be shocked for them to be around for more than one or two projects. To most, Hal Jordan is not just a Green Lantern, he is the Green Lantern who people have waited decades to see done right in live action, whether that was in a movie or show like Lanterns. And I completely understand people's extreme frustration towards this decision, because I do think it's a decision that limits some of the story potential for the Lantern section of the DCU, as Hal is so vitally important to not only Lantern Corps stories, but also just DC stories in general, and with him being much older than characters like Superman, Supergirl, Jon Stewart, as well as others like Batman and Wonder Woman most likely, there's a really good chance Hal will not be present for a lot of these huge stories that hopefully the DCU gets to one day tell, and I think that's an absolute bummer. Also, don't get me wrong, I love myself some Guy Gardner, but if you would have told me a few years back that most likely Guy Gardner is going to appear in far more projects in a brand new DC cinematic universe than Hal Jordan, I probably would have punched you in the face, because that's just ridiculous, but that's kind of the reality of the DCU as of right now. However, with all that in mind, I do not think that just because they made the controversial decision to age up Hal Jordan, that means that the Lantern story is doomed to fail. Just because there are perhaps story alternatives that I think have even more potential, that does not mean that what HBO is currently developing cannot be truly phenomenal. I think another great example of this idea in the DCU is The Brave and the Bold, and the idea of starting with Damian as Robin. I understand it from a world construction perspective, as it's a way to get the extended Bat family established much faster, as fans have been begging to see the Bat family for years in live action. However, from a story perspective, I would have much rather seen the progression from Dick Grayson as Robin all the way to Damian as Robin over a saga of Batman films and shows. But just because that's what I think would be better, that does not mean I think that The Brave and the Bold is going to be some awful movie, and truthfully, that's my attitude towards Lanterns. Just because I think there's perhaps better alternatives, that does not mean if you have the right vision and the right creatives and actors in place, you cannot tell a phenomenal story. I understand why it might be a frustrating decision still, but we are still getting Hal Jordan and Jon Stewart, something that Lanterns fans have been begging to see in live action for years. Yes, Hal may have a little bit more gray in his beard than you would like to see, but he's still gonna be Hal Jordan. I definitely agree that having Jon and Hal be much closer in age would be better, but this is the route that the DCU is going, and they obviously have a very clear direction and story for which they're attempting to tell. If we spend all this time talking about older Hal Jordan, we might as well talk about the actor tasked with bringing him to life in the show, and that of course is Kyle Chandler. Now, you may hate the idea of an older Hal Jordan, and I get that, but if you say that Kyle Chandler is bad casting for an older Hal Jordan, we're simply going to disagree, because I think he's a really good choice, not only for just any version of an older Hal Jordan, but specifically what we think we are going to be getting from the character in the show, and I think he's a far more interesting choice for the role than the supposed original offer for the role, which was of course Josh Brolin, who is without a doubt a phenomenal actor, but I simply do not get any Hal Jordan vibes from him. And based on what we know about the show, this version of Hal is an experienced vet that is going to be teaching the younger Jon Stewart the ropes as he eventually grows into the main Green Lantern of Earth and the DCU, and I think based on that premise, Kyle Chandler is just perfect for the job, especially when you look at some of his previous works, most specifically Friday Night Lights as Coach Taylor, where he consistently served as the mentor. Now, based on the short snippet we got a couple of weeks back, Hal may not really necessarily love the role of mentor, as we do see his teaching style to be quite dangerous as he sends John off a cliff, but as the show goes on, I'm sure John and Hal are going to grow a little bit closer, and we'll be able to see a bit more of Coach Taylor's shine through in Kyle Chandler's performance. Kyle Chandler is somebody who I just believe has been a really consistent performer and deserves a shot like this to better show off what he's capable of, and I have no doubt he's going to deliver a stellar performance as long as the writing is up to par, which we're going to talk a bit more in depth about in a little bit. But now I think it's about time we talk about the star of the show, and the character that is most likely going to be featured as the main lantern in the DCU, and potentially star alongside characters like Superman, Wonder Woman, Batman, as well as others in the Justice League, that of course being Jon Stewart, who is set to be played by a rising star in Aaron Pierre, and for me this is just A+ casting, not only because I think he's probably going to kill it in the role, but this is the exact type of casting that the DCU consistently needs to make, as I do think it's going to pay huge dividends in the years to come, as I think he's only going to continue to get more popular, and I definitely think he can be one of the major pillars of this franchise. Physically, he looks like a superhero, and he has shown to be a solid actor, with the crown jewel of his film and TV history being his performance in Rebel Ridge, where he just has a magnetic presence and confidence that I think showcases a lot of what we might get from his portrayal as Jon. Jon Stewart is the Lantern that was my favorite growing up, as I was first introduced to DC through the Justice League animated series, and I'm just so happy we get to see him become a major focus in the DCU. I often think Jon gets a bad rap, as he is often labeled boring, especially when compared to Hal, and sadly when it comes to the comics, Jon definitely lacks the iconic stories that Hal or even Kyle Rayner have, but I really do think if written correctly, Jon is a great character that, yes, may be a bit more reserved and stoic compared to Hal, which I think makes him more difficult to write, as people can oftentimes forget to give him any personality, but when done correctly, Jon does have personality, just not as fun or wisecracking as Hal can be. As a soldier, he is much more focused on the responsibility of the ring and what it means to be a Lantern. He is a great strategist and leader, and I really think Aaron Pierre possesses the ability to not only display those things, as I think he has showcased a lot of that already in Rebel Ridge, but he has a charisma and magnetism to bring a little bit more to the character, and I truly have high hopes for Jon in the DCU because of this phenomenal casting. But the best part about the show Lanterns is the fact that we're getting both Jon and Hal working together. It doesn't matter which one you prefer. Of course, both characters are phenomenal on their own, but when put together, I think they balance each other out really well and provide what the other is oftentimes missing. They're a phenomenal duo, and I cannot wait to see how their relationship evolves over the entirety of season 1, which I'm sure will start with Hal as the mentor teaching Jon how to use the ring and what it means to be a Lantern, with perhaps a little tension between the mentor and mentee, but by the end, I do believe they'll probably become true partners, and I cannot wait to see that growth. I know it's a common trope in a lot of like buddy cop movies and shows, but I'd be lying if I said I did not love those types of stories. Again, I cannot emphasize enough, we are literally getting Hal Jordan and Jon Stewart together in a show with a dash of Guy Gardner, as well as potentially other Lanterns showing up. I, as well as many others, have been begging DC to acknowledge the existence of the Lantern Corps for over a decade since the release of the Ryan Reynolds Green Lantern movie, and finally, a decade and a half later, our wishes are finally being answered. Now, just because you have some great characters from the comics and have made some very good castings in my opinion, that does not mean you're gonna have a great show or a movie. They need to be utilized and written correctly, and that is why it is vital to curate a phenomenal creative team that comes in with a clear vision for the story they want to tell, and they execute that story. And for Lanterns, I think they've developed a phenomenal creative team. To kick it off is the showrunner Chris Mundy, who is best known for his work on Ozark, True Detective, as well as Bloodline, which is honestly probably why Kyle Chandler got the job as Hal, as he is phenomenal in that show. But of course, out of these, the clear standout in the show that I feel that most are familiar with is Ozark, which is a phenomenal show that really showcases Mundy's ability to create tension, put characters into stressful moral dilemmas, and it's a great showcase of long-term storytelling. Additionally, even though he may not be behind the camera, his writing and creative direction has led to a lot of actors giving the best performances of their career. If your idea is to make a Lantern series heavily inspired by True Detective, outside of Nick Pizzolatto, Chris Mundy is one of the best showrunners one could ask for, and getting a talent like Mundy shows that DC and HBO clearly had a very clear pitch and direction that attracted a great creative like Mundy to sign on and further flesh out that vision. Also, we can be honest, for a lot of TV shows and even movies in the comic book space, a lot of people brought in to be the showrunner or director have simply not had the prestige of a creative like Mundy. Whether that's due to the constraints of working in a connected universe like the MCU or the specific projects themselves, or perhaps just simply not wanting to pay the necessary money to get a top talent because you believe that the IP is going to bring in the people, not really the creative, which, if I'm not going to lie to you, I do honestly think is a very reasonable argument from the studio's perspective, and maybe just taking a risk on a much lesser known creative who might be just as good creatively but just doesn't require as big of a paycheck does make sense. But I definitely like seeing the DCU going out there and getting these established creatives that have shown they are able to get the job done. And I really do think it bodes well for the quality level that we are going to be getting with Lanterns. However, what's so exciting about Lanterns is the fact that it's not just Chris Mundy. They also brought in Damon Lindelof as an executive producer. Now, to be clear, Mundy is still the show's actual showrunner, and I do think any final creative decisions would be made by Mundy, but Damon Lindelof is arguably even more accomplished of a creative with his work on things like Lost, Star Trek, and my personal favorite, his Watchmen miniseries that he did for HBO. Having an amazing duo of creatives like that at the helm of the show gives me the utmost confidence. At minimum, we are going to be getting a very solid project, which is leaps and bounds better than anything we have previously gotten with Green Lantern in live action. But with those two, there is also the potential for truly something amazing, as both have delivered amazing projects in the past. And in Lindelof's case, it was already something within the comic book TV show genre. Now, say Lindelof and Mundy don't do anything for you, there is also Tom King, who is serving as a writer and producer, and as I'm saying this, I'm realizing, depending on what side of the Tom King fence you fall on, I may be only making you less excited for Lanterns, as I don't know if there's a comic book writer today that elicits both such negative and positive responses from fans, but hopefully Tom King's contributions on this show are far more closer to the quality of things like Mr. Miracle and Supergirl, as opposed to Batman or Wonder Woman. I also think it's important to highlight some of the great directors that they brought in to shoot some of these episodes. Currently, the directors include Stephen Williams, who is known for his work on things like Watchmen and Westworld, Alex Sakharov, who has directed episodes like Game of Thrones and Ozark, Geeta Patel, who has worked on House of Dragon, and most notably James Hawes, who not only has directed a lot of episodes of television, including several episodes for the show Slow Horses, but also has done some good theatrical work with a film like The Amateur, which came out last year, and I personally was a fan of. It's nothing too amazing, but I thought it was good. The point I'm trying to make is, from the top down, behind the scenes, there are a lot of experienced creatives who not only have worked in prestige TV, but have excelled. These are not people just stepping into the big leagues for the first time, and that gives me a lot of confidence, as there is a legit body of work for all of these people to show that they can deliver. No, of course, it doesn't guarantee that they're going to deliver for this specific series, just like if they got somebody with a bit lesser of experience or hasn't really done prestige TV like this before, that doesn't mean that they would be guaranteed to fail. It is still just a crapshoot when it comes to making these things, as there's so many different ideas, so many different people trying to work together. But if I'm trying to assemble a championship team, I'd rather have a bunch of veterans who have already done it, already perhaps have rings on their fingers, instead of taking a bunch of the top prospects from, say, the draft or AAA. You would much rather have the experience. And I think it's a really wise decision by DC to be heavily investing in that area, especially for a show that could launch a sector of the DCU that hypothetically could act as its own cinematic universe with all of the mythology and lore that the Green Lanterns have. So to recap so far, DC has assembled a creative team with some of the best in the industry, especially for the specific genre they are trying to work in, and they have casted a leading Kyle Chandler who has done phenomenal work on TV for decades and absolutely fits the mold for an older Hal Jordan. Alongside Kyle Chandler, they casted Aaron Pierre, who is a rising star who absolutely looks the part, and his much more limited time as an actor has shown some very solid acting chops, and with a sign-off from Mundy, Lindelof, and presumably James Gunn, who have all shown themselves to be very capable when it comes to casting, I think that's a foundation for something truly special, and that's not even to mention some of the fun places they could be taking the story. Which, as of right now, when it comes to the story, it's all just rumor and speculation, so even though I briefly want to talk about some theories, for the most part, I do want to stick to actually what we know and what has been said by the people actually working on Lanterns. First off, we are getting Sinestro, who's going to be played by Ulrich Thompson, which is just awesome. Sinestro is one of DC's best villains, and the relationship/rivalry between Hal and Sinestro is one of DC's best. I'm curious to see what role he may play. I doubt the show is going to be taking on anything like the Sinestro Corps War, and just due to the overall premise and the fact that it takes place on Earth and follows this murder mystery, I'd be surprised if Sinestro ended up being the main villain of the series. He's probably going to have a very small role, and that makes me wonder, what could that small role be? Maybe he's imprisoned on Oa in the Central Power Battery, and John or Hal have to go to Oa to talk to Sinestro to try to learn more about whatever this mystery is. Also, locking him in the Central Power Battery could help set up for a certain storyline like Emerald Twilight, which is one of the storylines that is the most heavily theorized that Lanterns could be potentially adapting. And I have to just quickly go off on my little Emerald Twilight tangent. I'll admit, I totally understand why so many people believe it's possible, especially with an older Hal, that Lanterns could be adapting Emerald Twilight. It'd be a very easy way to make John the main Lantern of the DCU, as it would take Hal Jordan out of the picture. But to get that done in one season of a TV series where you're mostly introducing these characters for the first time in this universe, I think would be absolute lunacy, because you'd be doing the exact same thing that the comic storyline did wrong years ago, and that was rushing this story, because I do think as a concept, Emerald Twilight actually has a whole lot of a potential, but you need to take your time with it, especially when you don't already know the characters that are going to be feeling the wrath of Hal Jordan along his conquest. If I don't care about the Lantern Corps or some of the other Lantern members, what happens in the story of Emerald Twilight doesn't mean as much, so I would really hope if they ever were going to adapt Emerald Twilight, it would be over the span of a couple of seasons, and maybe they would hint to it in this season. And to be clear, I am all for Emerald Twilight. I do think there's immense potential, and I am all for getting a storyline to set up the GOAT Kyle Rayner. But if they do adapt this in season 1, I will just say flat out right now, I would be shocked if they actually turn out a good season of television. So I'm really hoping they don't. But that's the end of my Emerald Twilight tangent. Let's get back to the positives and why I think Lantern still does have immense potential, starting off with, of course, getting back to Sinestro, who again is one of DC's best characters, and I cannot wait to see what Sinestro and Hal's relationship is like in the show. Obviously, these are two much older actors, and I assume we're going to be dealing with a Sinestro and Hal that have a lot of history together, and I would love if the show provided some of that history via flashback. Now, I believe a lot of the flashbacks that we're going to be getting in the show are going to be about John and Hal's childhood, but I would love to see maybe a former fight or a mission with Hal and Sinestro. I think that'd be a great way to provide some of the stuff that people are really sad they may be missing out on with a older Hal and an older Sinestro. Alongside Sinestro, it's rumored that Atrocitus and Black Hand are going to be in the show, and out of those, it definitely seems like Black Hand is almost kind of like confirmed. I shouldn't say confirmed because it isn't, but it definitely seems like Black Hand is going to be a part of the story. Atrocitus is a bit more of a rumor, but if that is true and we're going to be getting Black Hand and Atrocitus, it makes me think that perhaps an adaptation of Secret Origin could be in play, just with some of the roles changed up to feature John. Now, obviously, I don't think they're going to be doing a one-for-one adaptation, but I do think they could definitely be using some story as inspiration, and Secret Origin does make a lot of sense, especially in regards to Black Hand, as it does really seem like he's going to be a part of this series. Because when James Gunn talked about the mystery that ties into the larger DCU, he definitely could have been referring to Blackest Night, which is no doubt one of DC's best stories, but again, I do think it'd be really dumb to try to adapt that right off the bat. I will say Mundy has been quoted saying that he hopes one season of Lanterns does turn into several, so that does definitely make me think if we were going to be getting something like Blackest Night, it may just be set up in season 1 and we learn more about what that is, and then it's continued on in either a movie or future seasons of Lanterns. However, though, when it comes to the story, again, this is all just rumors and theories, and there's a good chance none of what I'm talking about gets adapted, so I'm going to just trust the creative team I just said was phenomenal to deliver something great. But if the rumors are true and we do get Black Hand and Atrocitus alongside Sinestro, that's an immensely exciting group of villains to be headlining the show. Now, outside of the casting of an older Hal Jordan, one of the things that I feel fans are most worried about is the fact that this show has been pitched to be very heavily grounded and Earth-based, which simply doesn't sound like a true Lantern story. Yes, of course, there have been plenty of pivotal stories and moments on Earth in the comics, but when you think of the best of Green Lantern, you think of a comic that is a cosmic adventure that is epic, filled with action, and of course, nothing that sounds like True Detective, which of course is what is heavily inspiring this series. So I totally understand the idea of being a bit worried that this show could attempt to be too grounded, because that's probably my biggest fear for the show as well. However, I do think the reason they are pitching it like this, and perhaps even making it a bit more grounded to start, is to appeal to a broader audience and make it more accessible. I do think Mundy and Lindelof have attempted to calm some of those worries, saying it will honor their characters from the comics, and it will still very much be a Green Lantern series. However, there's one quote from James Hawes which has calmed my nerves the most, and that is when he said that we will meet these characters in a rooted way before it goes intergalactic. Now, if you don't trust James Hawes, that's completely understandable. I don't know if I should be trusting him as well, but he has no reason to lie. It's not like he's heavily invested in the future of the DCU. He shot his episodes. I'm sure he's never planning on returning to the DCU, but I do think what he describes makes a lot of sense. The show may start in the Midwest following a murder of perhaps a former Lantern. As the series begins, it's much less focused on the power of the rings and the abilities Lanterns possess, but much more about the people, grounding them and making you care for who Hal and John are. And I'm sure we'll get a lot of their backstories, which will be fleshed out via flashback, and we will learn more about the Lantern Corps as John does from Hal or any Lanterns that may appear. John is going to be the show's main protagonist, and I assume most of the story will be from his perspective. As he learns, we learn, and when we first meet John, I think it's very possible that he does not yet have the ring, or at least based on the teaser we saw, that's very likely. So yes, I'll admit, I do think it's quite possible that the first couple of episodes of this series are going to lack some action, which definitely could suck, but if the writing is good, and again, I trust the writing team, I know I won't care. However, as the series progresses, I think it'll start to embrace more of their abilities, and I think by the last few episodes, the idea of this show being super grounded and just being, literally True Detective, but with Jon Stewart and Hal Jordan, will be a thing of the past. I understand though if you're a bit more skeptical and need to see it to believe it. I definitely could be forcing myself to believe that's what's gonna happen. But in all honesty, when it comes to Lanterns and when we look at what we know are the facts about this show, I think they've assembled a phenomenal creative team with some of the industry's best who have delivered top tier television in the past. They have a bunch of good actors who I think are great for the roles they are playing and have picked comic characters who are some of DC's best. All of those things combined give me the hope that Lanterns could be truly something special. Of course, we are just talking about potential, so who knows, it may come out and be just absolutely awful, but I know I cannot wait to see Lanterns when it comes out later this year. However, now I want to know, are you excited for Lanterns? Whether you are or not, please let me know. I would love to hear your perspective. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all in another video.